Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. I'm Donna King, Editor-in-Chief of Carolina Journal, and this is the place you're going to get a weekly update on everything happening in North Carolina politics and public policy. We are now just a few days, less than a week from the 2024 election, so we've got all that information, all that detail coming. We have Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation, of course, with all his great analysis. And we have David Larson, the opinion editor for Carolina Journal. And joining us this week on the couch, we have Chris Cooper, author of Anatomy of a Purple State and director of the Hare Institute for Public Policy at Western Carolina University. Thanks so much for joining us. I've really been looking forward to this, getting great insight. Of course. Okay, well, let's start with Mitch first. Tell me what you're seeing. We've got big early voting numbers, about 3 million ballots already cast.
Yeah, a large percentage of people who are registered to vote already casting ballots in North Carolina well before Election Day, which for people like me who vote on Election Day makes things easier. The line will be shorter. That'll be nice. But at least to some extent, this is part of a plan that we are seeing from the Republican Party. Democrats have for years and years relied on early voting and getting the people who are most excited about voting out there and voting early. Republicans, for a number of cycles, have been less inclined to do that, more conservative, saying, I vote on Election Day, I'm going to stay voting on Election Day.
Right.
But the party itself and groups who get out the vote who are ideologically aligned with the Republicans have, especially in this cycle, said, look, we need to get your votes. If you're going to vote, get out and vote early. Vote, do the mail ballot or vote in person early so that we can try to get more of these low propensity voters out there to vote later during the early voting cycle or on Election Day. So we are seeing, I think, the results of the fact that Republicans are turning out more of their traditional Election Day voters to do early voting. What remains to be seen is, are they cannibalizing their vote? Is it a case of dipping into the pool on one end, putting it back in the other end and noticing that there's no change? Or are they actually going to be able to follow through on their strategy, and that is have a higher vote total because they can get more of those low propensity voters to get out either at the end of early voting or on Election Day itself. That's something we'll know once the results come in.
Well, we normally have a bump right there, but you think this year we might be no bump?
Well, it really depends. I mean, that is the question to be answered. Are they cannibalizing their votes, or are they getting the votes that they're trying to get now with the intention to get still a high turnout on Election Day of people who might not have voted otherwise, except for the fact that they're being pestered by the party and by their allies?
Yeah, of course. What did you notice about this? Kind of low Democrat turnout?
Yes, yeah. So in addition to Republicans going up, they went up sort of modestly. I believe it's 10,000 or so higher. But so that's changed, how that breaks down generally. But for Democrats, it seems like they usually are the ones that come out very strongly. And a few of the bigger voting blocks, for example, African American voters and young voters, have not come out at the same levels for early voting.
Right.
So that leads to the question. Maybe this is the last week of early voting. Will they come out strong in these last few days, and also will they come out strong maybe on Election Day? Because that's typically the GOP when they come out strongest. As Mitch said, are there enough GOP voters left, or have they been cannibalized? But also, have the Democrats, are they going to, if the GOP has done a historic thing by having so much come out on early voting, they'll kind of have to do the same on the Democrat side. They're going to need to sort of really focus on Election Day on turnout, which hasn't been their time to shine necessarily compared to the GOP.
Sure. Chris, the people in Western North Carolina are actually turning out at higher rates than the rest of the state. I thought that was really interesting. They're showing some real resilience. What are you seeing in this?
Yeah, they really are, right? So if we look at the 13 Helene counties, right? So there's a way to look at it with 25 FEMA. I would sort of caution folks against that. I live in one of the FEMA affected, but not the State Board of Elections affected counties. Just try to look at those. So just look at the 13. What you're seeing is a slightly, ever so slightly higher turnout among those Helene counties. But within that, I think there's some other interesting patterns. Usually those 13 outperformed the rest of the state.
Okay.
So there is a vantage point to look at this and say, hey, Helene's having no effect, right? It's about where it should be.
Sure.
There's another way to look at it to say it's a little bit down compared to what we've seen in previous years. And then the last wrinkle I'd throw in is that in-person early voting
Right.
is down for sure in those Helene counties, but mail voting is making
that's
up for it, which you would expect, right? If you've been displaced, you're going to vote by mail.
Sure.
So it remains to be seen what will happen on election day, but
Sure.
it's fascinating so far.
It is. So what are your thoughts on this going into this election, some of the
Yeah.
numbers you're seeing already?
I agree with everything the other panelists have talked about. I think Mitch's point about whether this is cannibalization of voters or whether they're growing new voters remains to be seen. The only thing I would add in the data that I've seen is unaffiliateds seem to be up a little bit in terms of voter turnout. We're used to those folks not showing up as much as the Democrats and Republicans. Yesterday, actually, they outperformed both of the major parties, and that's really unusual also. So from the one perspective, it looks great for the Republicans. They should spike the football and say, we got this thing.
Yeah.
I think from another perspective, it's we don't know what's happening with the unaffiliated. We don't know, as Mitch said, what's happening on election day. We just have to wait and see.
Do you think that means that, I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you.
I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say another thing that's interesting about that is while there are a ton of unaffiliateds and they now, I believe, outnumber both the Republicans
Right.
and Democrats
That's right.
as a group, most of those unaffiliateds are really functionally Democrats or Republicans. They just
Right.
don't want to be associated with the parties.
Sure.
So you have to know if you're looking at unaffiliateds, are they the unaffiliateds who are actually Democrats or
Right.
the unaffiliateds who are actually Republicans? The parties kind of have that information because they
Okay.
know who the
right.
voters are. They've got the data that they've compiled.
Right.
So they know. The rest of us, though, only see unaffiliated
Sure.
and have to guess.
I think that trend is especially emphasized for young voters. I saw the data for 18 to 25, where the Republicans were actually edging out Democrats
In that age group?
in that age group, and which was very surprising to people. But then you see, those were both about 58,000 each, with just a slight edge for Republicans.
Right.
But the unaffiliateds had almost 100,000, so it was almost double the other two. But so I think most of those, maybe Republicans say, hey, we have a slight advantage. But among young voters who aren't affiliated, I would imagine probably
Sure.
more of them are functionally Democrats.
Sure,
So-
sure. You spend a lot of time with young voters, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thought about this group? A lot more of them are registering unaffiliated, and it's nice to see they're turning out
Yeah.
in higher rates. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's actually a lot of, put aside partisanship for a second, there's some
Sure.
really good news, I think, in these early voting data. I think that we are seeing unaffiliated show up in greater numbers, which is a good thing. And the fact that we're not seeing polarization
Sure.
in terms of when parties cast their vote, I think ultimately, no matter who wins or loses, that's a good thing, right? The
Sure.
less partisan decisions around election administration seem, I think the better off we all are. So actually, there's a bit of positive news here.
Sure. With unaffiliated now turning out, were previously maybe not a big focus for the parties because they didn't know which way they were going to go. Do you think that changes that calculus for future elections?
I think it does, and I think as Mitch indicated,
Yeah.
it already has, I think, for many of the operatives, for many of the consultants, right? They have ways to be able to try to pinpoint. We do see a surprising number of these folks, though, flip partisan primaries. So about
Okay.
46% of these unaffiliated regular voters will vote in like the Democratic Party primary one time, the Republican Party primary the next. So it's a tough group to figure out.
And that's one reason why in North Carolina you might want to be an unaffiliated voter because it gives you a lot more flexibility than anyone who's tied to one of the major parties, or even worse, if you're tied to one of the smaller parties and you can't vote in anyone else's primary because you are tied to the Constitution Party or the Libertarian Party. Now, some of them, the hardcore members of those parties, are happy to do that. But if they would like to cast a ballot for someone other than the Constitution Party candidate for president, they have to wait till the general election because if they're in a party, you can't vote in someone else's primary. If you're unaffiliated, you can pick any primary.
Right.
That's
Very
part of it. Probably is there's not really an incentive to be a Democrat or Republican. So a lot of people, I think, are just might as well. I mean, you get more mail, which is one downside, but otherwise, there's not really an incentive.
Sure, sure.
And this is fairly new, right? So we used to actually lock unaffiliated voters out of partisan primaries in the state of North Carolina. The Republicans first opened up their primaries and said, come on in and try it, you might like it. And then the
Right.
Democrats did it about 8 years later. So there are some structural reasons, I think as everybody's pointing out,
Sure.
to see this increase in unaffiliated voters.
Now, tell me what led you to write anatomy of a purple state. I mean, this is basically what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
North Carolina, very, very blue in some areas, very, very red in others.
Right.
But in general, we're pretty free thinking, I think.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We're somewhere near the middle of the country, right, in almost any kind of metric. So part of it was there just hasn't been a lot written about kind of an overview of North Carolina politics and arguing about where we are as a state since the Republican takeover in 2010. And no matter where you sit in the political aisle, that was a monumental, arguably the monumental election really of the last 50 years in our state. So I wanted to try to have a one-stop source, not to finish people's search about North Carolina politics, but to start it, right? To give them a basis to go off of so then they could, continue to find new information about our state.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So I was curious. You noted that the Attorney General often goes Democrat. I think exclusively since the 1800s, or maybe have two appointed. Then Governor has often also. But then some of these national races more tend to lean Republican. Do you think that's a conscious decision by voters, or how do you think that breaks down to have ended up that way?
Yeah, I mean, for most voters, no, right? I think for most voters, they're definitely locked in Democrat or Republican. But there's no question that we do split our ticket more than really any other state in the country. So if we just grab 2020, grab all the Trump states, every state that voted for Donald Trump, only 5 Democrats won statewide in all of those Trump states. 4 of them were in the state of North Carolina. I mean, there's also a state Supreme Court Democrat justice in Ohio who won on that same ballot in 2020. So when I say that, we're purple, that we swing more than other folks, I think that's exactly what we're seeing in the data as we see election after election. I mean, the Attorney General one's a great case, right? And part of that's just kind of the weird history of our state where, like all southern states, we're overwhelmingly Democrat, and then we had a couple of juggernaut Democrats running again and again and again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we term limited our Attorney General, for example, if we might have actually gotten some more Republicans in sooner into that office. But no, it's been dominated exclusively by the Democratic Party, while the presidential election obviously has been mostly dominated by the Republican Party.
You also note, I guess, some competing trends. One is that rural Southern voters in general have moved away from that solid Democrat to now being pretty solid in most of the, I think 75 of the, more than that, of the 100 counties are pretty solidly Republican.
Yes.
80 or so. And then another trend being the cosmopolitan nature of all these people moving to North Carolina's urban areas and maybe from more liberal areas. And those two trends where we're growing in our more liberal areas, but also the rural areas are now heading red. So it's kind of, how do you see those two trends playing out?
It's really interesting, right? So, I mean, some people have seen the title of this book and say, well, purple doesn't describe my neighborhood. Purple doesn't describe my community or the people that I tend to go to church with or meet at the corner bar. But it's because we don't have 100 purple counties, right? We don't have, everybody's not walking around as a moderate. We average to something that looks like moderation. And I think those two trends is exactly why. We've got the rural areas becoming increasingly Republican, and we have a sizable number of rural voters, second most in the United States. You can't ignore the rural vote here like you can to some degree in Georgia. But then we do have some folks that are moving in and actually changing the state and liberalizing some parts of it. And so we're going to see, I think, continue to see a purple state, but that does not mean we're going to continue to see purple politics. I think, ironically, quite the opposite.
I had one more question if you guys want
please.
to jump in, but you're talking about professionalizing the legislature. I thought it was interesting, something that people have been talking about for a while in terms of pay or other things. So just think, why do you think that is such an important thing to focus on, and what do you think would, I guess for those who wouldn't know what that means, kind of why would that be necessary?
Yeah, so when we think about professionalism or professionalization, we don't mean like, are you wearing a tie or a suit?
Sure.
What we mean is, how much money do you make as a state legislator? How many staff do you have? And how long are you in session? So if you're higher on any of those metrics, you say you're a more professional state legislature. So we're a state that, as y'all know well, puts the General Assembly first. 3 constitutions, all 3 say, General Assembly, you're number 1. Not first among equals, just plain number 1.
Sure.
But we pay them a whopping $13,951 a year.
They get the $100 per diem.
They get 104, right? And Spohn always points that out, which is a good thing to point out. I stayed last night at a Hampton Inn around here, and it cost me more than $104. It wasn't exactly the lap of luxury, right? Hard to live off $13,951 and 104.
Right.
We're also in session a radically different number of days every year, seems to go longer. We don't have many staff, and so I say we should increase that because it's the most important branch of government. They're the most powerful members of our state, for good, bad, or indifferent, but we're not resourcing them like that. And so it changes the nature of the types of people who can and want to run for office. It also, the limited number of staff tends to increase the power of lobbyists. Lobbyists aren't evil, they're not scurrilous. I write about lobbyists, all of whom actually that I profile I like a lot in this book. But I don't think any of us would say, you know, I really want a state where lobbyists have the expertise and the power. And so by having so few staff, particularly on the minority side, they just don't have any way to insulate themselves from lobbyist information. And then the session length thing has just gotten radically out of control because we have no limits, so it's bigger some years and smaller others. Just imagine I got a 9-year-old and 11-year-old at home. I was trying to plan my life around being in Raleigh some rando number of days every year, right? Not a very appealing
especially if you
process.
live that far out west.
Exactly.
Coming in, so.
That's exactly right.
Right, very interesting. Yeah.
An interesting thing, of course, you have been a resource for people outside of North Carolina trying to figure out what's happening with our politics, and I'm guessing that that will become even more common once the book really gets out there and gets some traction. What's the biggest misconception that people outside of North Carolina have about our politics?
So many, right? So I'll grab a couple real quick. The rural piece, I think, is part of it. Rural matters here in a way that it doesn't matter in many other states and really in every other battleground state. And so I think that explains so much of our politics. I think the other thing is people tend to, look, when they come in, they parachute in, they want to look at a state, what's the first thing they do? They go to Wikipedia and they look at the color of the map, the last few presidential elections, and that hides margins, right? So yes, of course, Donald Trump won in 2020 in North Carolina. He won fair and square, and his margin was the smallest in North Carolina of any state that he won. 2008, Barack Obama won North Carolina, fair and square. Guess what? Smallest margin of every state that he won. So I think sometimes we overread this red-blue map and don't look enough at margins.
Very interesting. Now, that's one of the things that we've been saying is that North Carolina, I think there was a study out that said we're the second most powerful vote this time in this 2024 election. Why do you think that is, first? And do you have any predictions?
Yes, I have one prediction. I'll hit that one first.
All right.
Steve Troxler is likely to win Commissioner of Agriculture. I
pretty good
assume
one, yeah.
that's the race he meant.
Get a state fair during the election. Yeah.
I actually saw a Steve Troxler ad this time around, so I don't think I've ever seen that
Right,
before.
right.
Riding in a tractor, like, oh, hey, okay.
That's exactly right.
Sure.
So yeah, I think as far as predictions, I'm not entirely sure, and I have now dropped the first part of your question after my Steve
Sure.
Troxler
Why
joke.
do you think North Carolina is the second most powerful vote in this presidential election?
Because it is unpredictable. Because we are a state where margins matter. So we can look at the presidency, but I think the best example is the Paul Newby, Sherry Beasley race from a few rounds ago, right? Chief Justice of the North Carolina State Supreme Court, statewide office, 401 votes separating these two candidates, right? So like a marginal difference can make the difference in who wins that election. When I talk to students about this, I ask them like, how many friends do you have on social media? How many contacts? It's always more than 401. So like you have more social media contacts than the difference between people running for a statewide office.
Wow.
Yeah, it's like 4 people a county.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to look at
That's
it. Yeah.
exactly right.
And I think actually in that said Nevada was the only one that had more powerful voters, but in most of the breakdowns of possible electoral victories, Nevada doesn't even really come into play. So I think we're probably
That bumps us up, doesn't it?
yeah, that makes us number 1.
Very
I think.
interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Anatomy of a Purple State. You can get it on Amazon, North Carolina, UNC Press.
Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here. And please tune in on election night. We will be live here at Carolina Journal with all of our analysts, all of our reporters, bringing you the latest information on what's happening on election night. So make sure you tune in there. Thanks so much, and please get out and vote.